10 Mind-blowing alcohol facts. Drinking has been so widespread throughout history that Patrick McGovern, an archaeological chemist at the University of Pennsylvania, called it a universal language in an Economist article. Indeed, you're hard-pressed to find a culture or event in history that alcohol, or lack of it, didn't feature in some way. In a sense, alcoholic beverages are just a simple matter of chemistry and physiology. When yeast cells consume carbohydrates in grains, vegetables or fruits, they produce a fluid called ethyl alcohol. The latter, when ingested by humans, is converted into a chemical called acetaldehyde, and then eventually broken down into carbon dioxide and water. While ethyl alcohol is toxic in large enough doses, in more moderate quantities it merely relaxes the muscles and stimulates the brain by depressing inhibitions. But that explanation hardly does justice to a substance that people have been eagerly producing and consuming since the dawn of human civilization. The ancient Sumerians, who lived 4,500 years ago, even worshipped a goddess, Ninkasi, who ruled over the brewing and distributing of beer to the populace. In a royal tomb, we find figures sucking brew with straws out of what resembles a modern beer keg. Here are 10 fascinating facts about alcohol that will enrich your cocktail conversations. Number 10. Wine was invented before the wheel. It's not clear precisely when our ancient ancestors started imbibing, but most likely, ancient hunter-gatherers discovered the effects of alcohol when they found and ate fruit that had dropped to the ground and fermented. Humans liked that tipsy feeling so much that when they switched to being farmers and living in stable communities, they started trying to make the stuff deliberately. Archaeological chemist Patrick McGovern analyzed shards of clay from a 9,000-year-old Chinese village and found that they contained chemical traces of mead, a wine made from honey. The ancient beverage had an alcohol content of 10%. Meanwhile, the potter's wheel wasn't invented until 3,500 years later in Mesopotamia, and wheeled chariots weren't developed until probably 300 years after that. So we know, at least, that the earliest mead drinkers didn't have to worry about finding designated drivers. Number 9. A beer was once made from Antarctic ice. If you're a beer aficionado, you're probably familiar with brands of brew whose makers tout them as being made with mountain spring water or some other exotic ingredient. But in 2010, Nail Brewing, an Australian company, found a way to top all that. It created a limited edition batch of beer using water made from melted Antarctic ice. The latter had been brought back by the Sea Shepherd Conservation Society, an activist group that had staged an anti-whaling campaign in the southern, Antarctic, Ocean. But you couldn't buy Antarctic Nail Ale at your local bottle shop. It was auctioned off at hefty prices of up to $1,850 Australian dollars, nearly $1,614 a bottle, with the proceeds going to the conservation group. Number 8. Tequila only can come from Mexico. According to Mexican law, which the U.S. honors, the famously fiery beverage must contain at least 51% liquor distilled from the sweet nectar of blue agave. That desert plant grown primarily in Jalisco, though 4 other Mexican states also are allowed to legally produce tequila. The name comes from the Tequila Indians of Jalisco. When South African distillers started making their own version of the beverage in the early 2000s, using a plant similar to agave, Mexico didn't like the idea of being undercut. Its diplomats used international trade agreements to prevent South African companies from calling their product tequila. Instead, they were compelled to market it as agave. Number 7. Wine doesn't necessarily get better with age. For someone who isn't steeped in wine knowledge, it's easy to listen to wine buffs talk about the vintage of various wines, that is, the year in which they were bottled, and assume that the older a wine is, the better. But that's not how it works. The most important thing about vintage is the particular year itself, what the weather conditions were back then, and what impact they might have had upon the grape harvest and the quality of the wine produced from it. As for age, that's more often a negative than a positive, according to wine writer Giles Kime. The vast majority of wines, particularly whites, become increasingly dull and flaccid with age, he writes in his book, Secrets of Wine: Insider Secrets into the Real World of Wine. Only a few high-quality reds and some champagnes improve over time, and even that is very much a matter of personal taste. Apart from those exceptions, wines generally should be consumed within a year or two of bottling. Number 6. The U.S. government used to poison alcohol. During Prohibition in the 1920s, the U.S. federal government tried to outlaw the sale of booze, wine and beer, and that didn't go over very well. By mid-decade, officials in the administration of President Calvin Coolidge were frustrated because so many Americans continued to drink bootlegged alcohol. They decided upon a devious, or rather, murderous, tactic. Knowing that millions of gallons of industrial alcohol were being stolen by bootleggers and used to make beverages, they ordered manufacturers in 1926 to add poison such as formaldehyde, chloroform and methyl alcohol to their products. Quickly, illicit drinkers began dying in droves, and the toll became so shocking that New York City Medical Examiner actually held a press conference to warn the public about the plot. The United States government must be charged with the moral responsibility for the deaths that poisoned liquor causes, although it cannot be held legally responsible, he railed. It did little good. 400 people died in New York alone from poisoned booze, and the following year, the death toll climbed to 700. The fiendish deterrent program didn't stop until Prohibition was repealed in December 1933. Number 5. Studies show that abstaining is riskier to health than drinking. For decades, we've all heard the warnings about how excessive drinking can turn your liver into Swiss cheese, and cause all sorts of other awful physical woes as well. But when scientists actually got around to studying the death rates of drinkers and non-drinkers, they made a startling discovery. For reasons that aren't entirely clear, abstaining from drinking actually tends to increase your risk of dying. In a study published in 2010 in the scientific journal Alcoholism, Clinical and Experimental Research, University of Texas at Austin psychologist Charles Holohan found that over a 20-year period, 69% of abstainers died. That actually was higher than the 60% death rate for heavy drinkers. But the longest-lived group among the 1,824 study participants was composed of moderate drinkers, only 41% of whom died in that period. Holohan and his co-researchers did a model controlling for former problem drinking, existing health problems and other factors. They found that even after the adjustments, abstainers and heavy drinkers continued to show increased mortality risks of 51 and 45%, respectively, compared to moderate drinkers. Other studies have painted a more complicated picture. A study published in 2013 in Population Research Policy Review, for example, found that the reasons why someone drinks or doesn't drink may affect mortality. And another study, this one out of Germany, published November 2, 2021 in the journal PLOS Medicine, indicated that, the majority of the alcohol abstainers at baseline were former alcohol consumers and had risk factors that increased the likelihood of early death. Former alcohol use disorders, risky alcohol drinking, ever having smoked tobacco daily, and fair to poor health were associated with early death among alcohol abstainers. Even so, the consensus seems to be that light drinking is associated with the lowest health risks, while heavy drinking is still dangerous. Number 4. Diet mixers in cocktails get you drunk faster. People who are worried about gaining weight from the empty calories in booze might try to compensate by using diet soda when they make a 7 and 7 or a rum and coke. But there's a catch that could land you in the drunk tank. In a study published in 2013 in the journal Alcoholism, Clinical and Experimental Research, researchers from Northern Kentucky University reported that drinkers who consumed artificially sweetened mixers had a significantly higher breath alcohol reading than those who used mixers containing sugar, which apparently slows the absorption of alcohol into the bloodstream. Worse yet, individuals were unaware of these differences, a factor that may increase the safety risks associated with drinking alcohol, the scientists noted. Number 3. Whiskey starts out clear. Part of the ambiance of whiskey is that rich amber color that reminds you that you're drinking something that was carefully aged for years, like a prized pair of Levi's or a tweed jacket that you've adorned with leather elbow patches as the fabric frayed. But you might be surprised to learn that the color actually is added on, in the same fashion. Ethyl alcohol is clear, and so are most varieties of whiskey at the start. But after distilling, the liquor is aged in oak casks that have been air-dried for 9 months and then heated on the inside to give the wood a charred red layer, that is rich in wood sugars and caramelized tannin. Those chemicals, when they're absorbed by the whiskey, change its taste and give it the amber color. Number 2. Americans once drank more alcohol than water. Early Americans would be shocked by the current level of alcohol consumption in the nation, because it's so much less than they used to drink. In the 1600s and 1700s, many Americans saw alcohol not just as a pleasant diversion, but as a miraculous medicine that could cure illnesses, strengthen the weak and pep up old people. As a result, they often started the day with a liquor pick-me-up and then consumed more alcohol steadily throughout the day, sometimes finishing with several rounds at a tavern in the evening. In 1790, according to federal government data, the average American over the age of 15 consumed the following over a year: 34 gallons, 129 liters, of beer and cider. 5 gallons, 19 liters, of whiskey or other distilled spirits. 1 gallon, 4 liters, of wine. In 2020, however, the typical American drank over the course of the year about 26.1 gallons, 98 liters, of beer and cider. 2.3 gallons, 8 liters, of spirits. 3.09 gallons of wine, 11 liters. Part of the reason for the heavy consumption back then was that water was often unsafe to drink. Even though this was more of a problem in Europe, the earliest settlers followed the example of their European forebears who were used to substituting beer or wine for water. One of the few liquor naysayers in colonial times was physician Benjamin Rush, who developed the theory that alcoholism was a disease, but hardly anyone listened to him. Number 1. White wine can be made from red grapes. The wordy wine snob portrayed by Paul Giamatti in the movie, Sideways, probably could have expounded on this fact at length, but for those of us who think of fine wine as anything that doesn't come with a screw top, it probably comes as a surprise. You can make white wine from red grapes. Champagne, for example, is made from Pinot Noir and Pinot Meunier grapes, both red grapes, as well as Chardonnay, and the 3 types of grapes are often blended. All grape juice, which comes from the inside of the grapes, starts out as white. It's the skin that contains the red pigment. If the juice is squeezed out of the grapes and separated quickly from the skins, it remains white. By contrast, if winemakers are producing a red wine, they allow the juice to remain in contact with the red skins during fermentation. This causes the wine to become dark.